History is filled with powerful leaders, but some left behind a legacy of fear, destruction, and cruelty. Who were the most evil dictators, and what made them so infamous? From orchestrating mass killings to enforcing brutal regimes, these leaders controlled nations with an iron fist, silencing opposition and instilling terror. Let's uncover the terrifying stories of history's worst dictators, from Adolf Hitler to Vladimir Putin, Saddam Hussein, Joseph Stalin, and others. Adolf Hitler. Few names in history evoke as much terror and destruction as Adolf Hitler. As the dictator of Nazi Germany from 1933 to 1945, he plunged the world into World War II, a conflict that claimed over 75 million lives, the deadliest war in human history. Hitler's thirst for power and conquest led to the invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, igniting a global catastrophe. But his most horrifying legacy remains the Holocaust, the systematic genocide of 6 million Jewish men, women, and children. Under his rule, Nazi Germany established an extensive network of concentration and extermination camps, including infamous sites like Auschwitz. At Auschwitz alone, over 1.1 million people were murdered through gas chambers, forced labor, and starvation. His brutal ideology of racial superiority and totalitarian control transformed Germany into a formidable war machine, leaving entire cities in ruins. As Allied forces closed in on Berlin in April 1945, Hitler, once seen as the most powerful man in Europe, hid in an underground bunker, refusing to accept defeat. On April 30th, 1945, he took his own life, marking the dramatic end of his reign of terror. While Hitler's reign ended in destruction, history has repeatedly seen strongmen rise to power, using war and oppression as tools of control. In the 21st century, Vladimir Putin has emerged as one of the most controversial and ruthless leaders. Vladimir Putin. How does a former KGB officer become one of the most cruel and bloodthirsty leaders of the modern world? Vladimir Putin, Russia's leader since 1999, has reshaped his country with an iron grip, crushing opposition and silencing dissent. Under his rule, journalists and political opponents have mysteriously disappeared or been assassinated. Anna Politkovskaya and Alexei Navalny are among the most well-known victims. His ambitions extend beyond Russia's borders, as seen in the 2008 invasion of Georgia, where Russian forces occupied 20% of its territory. In 2014, Putin shocked the world by illegally annexing Crimea, violating international law, and launching a war in eastern Ukraine. This conflict escalated into a full-scale Russian invasion in 2022, becoming the largest European war since World War II. But Ukraine and Georgia are not his only battlefields. Putin has propped up the brutal Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad, unleashing Russian airstrikes in Syria since 2015, targeting hospitals, civilian areas, and rebel forces in a devastating campaign that has left thousands dead. How far will he go to restore Russia's former Soviet power? Is Putin building an empire, or is he leading Russia toward collapse? Putin's authoritarian rule, marked by war crimes and ruthless oppression, has drawn comparisons to another infamous Soviet Union leader, Joseph Stalin. How does a man become the absolute ruler of a vast empire, wielding fear like a weapon? Joseph Stalin, the Soviet dictator from 1924 until his death in 1953, ruled with an iron grip, overseeing widespread purges, establishing forced labor camps, and enforcing policies that resulted in engineered famines claiming millions of lives. During the Great Purge of 1936 to 1938, hundreds of thousands were executed, and more than 1.5 million were sent to the gulags, often on charges of alleged disloyalty. Could one man be responsible for one of history's deadliest famines? The Holodomor, a Ukrainian famine of 1932 to 1933, claimed an estimated 3.9 million lives, a catastrophic outcome of harsh grain requisitions and forced collectivization. His paranoia knew no limits. He even purged the very generals who had led the USSR to victory in World War II. Stalin's reign of terror ended in 1953 with his death, officially attributed to a stroke, though some speculate he may have been poisoned by those around him, fearful of yet another purge. Yet Stalin was not the only 20th century leader to wield absolute power with devastating consequences. On the other side of the world, another dictator would rise. Mao Zedong. Rising to power in 1949 as the founding father of the People's Republic of China, Mao's rule would stretch nearly 3 decades. His Great Leap Forward, a disastrous attempt to industrialize China overnight, led to the worst famine in human history, killing an estimated 45 million people through starvation, forced labor, and brutal executions. His Cultural Revolution was equally ruthless, as he unleashed violent Red Guards upon intellectuals, teachers, and political rivals. Up to 2 million people were executed or driven to suicide. Even as his health declined, paranoia gripped him. Power was his only obsession. Mao's legacy remains a bitter divide, revered by some as a unifier, condemned by others as a butcher. Yet history has seen other leaders driven by radical visions that resulted in devastation. Just as Mao sought to reshape China with ruthless ambition, another dictator in Southeast Asia pursued his own brutal transformation. Pol Pot. What happens when a leader wages war against his own people? Pol Pot, the head of Cambodia's Khmer Rouge from 1975 to 1979, sought to transform his country into a self-sufficient agrarian society. But his vision resulted in one of the deadliest genocides in history. Under his rule, an estimated 1.5 to 2 million Cambodians, nearly a quarter of the population, died from execution, forced labor, starvation, and disease. Pol Pot was obsessed with erasing all foreign influence and class distinctions, forcing the entire population into the countryside to work in brutal conditions. His regime was overthrown in 1979 when Vietnam invaded Cambodia, but he escaped justice, living in the jungle until he died in 1998. He never fully admitted wrongdoing. Thousands of miles away, Kim Il-sung was crafting a totalitarian dynasty in North Korea, one that would outlive him and shape the fate of an entire nation for decades. Kim Il-sung. How does a leader hold absolute power for nearly 5 decades and shape a nation into a totalitarian fortress? Kim Il-sung, the founding dictator of North Korea, ruled from 1948 until his death in 1994, establishing one of the most repressive regimes in modern history. He led North Korea into the Korean War, which resulted in over 3 million deaths and permanently divided the peninsula. He built a state-controlled society where citizens were forced to worship him as a godlike figure, his portraits displayed in every home, and his speeches memorized in schools. His policies, including brutal purges of political rivals, labor camps, and forced relocations, led to the imprisonment of hundreds of thousands in concentration camps. Yet his legacy didn't end with his death. He established the world's first communist hereditary dictatorship, passing power to his son, Kim Jong-il, ensuring his family's rule continued indefinitely, plunging the nation even deeper into repression, isolation, and suffering. Kim Jong-il. Kim Jong-il, North Korea's dear leader, ruled from 1994 to 2011, creating one of the most repressive regimes in modern history. Under his leadership, North Korea became a hermit kingdom, sealed off from the world, where state propaganda elevated him to near godlike status while millions of his people starved. The North Korean famine of the 1990s, known as the Arduous March, led to the deaths of between 600,000 and 3 million people, while Kim spent lavishly on luxuries. Did you know he built a massive network of prison camps where up to 200,000 political prisoners, including entire families, were subjected to forced labor, torture, and execution? By the time of his death in December 2011, Kim had left North Korea even more isolated, impoverished, and terrorized, paving the way for his son, Kim Jong-un, to carry on his brutal legacy. While Kim Jong-il isolated his nation from the world, another infamous dictator took the opposite approach, seeking to expand his empire at all costs. Benito Mussolini. Benito Mussolini founded the fascist movement in 1919, capitalizing on Italy's post-World War I instability. By 1922, he orchestrated the infamous March on Rome, forcing King Victor Emmanuel III to appoint him prime minister. By 1925, Mussolini had dismantled democracy, banned political parties, using his secret police to arrest, torture, and eliminate opposition. Was his thirst for power limited to Italy? No. He sought to rebuild a Roman Empire, launching a brutal invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, where his forces used poison gas against civilians. In 1939, Mussolini allied with Hitler, dragging Italy into World War II, a catastrophic decision that led to military failures and widespread destruction. As his empire crumbled, Italians turned against him. In April 1945, he was captured by partisans while trying to flee to Switzerland, executed by firing squad, and his body was displayed in Milan, a grim end for a man who once dreamed of absolute power. Decades later, in a different part of the world, another leader would rise, one who ruled with an iron fist, silencing opposition, waging wars, and ultimately meeting a grim fate of his own. Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein, Iraq's ruler from 1979 to 2003, built his dictatorship on violence, repression, and war. After seizing power, he immediately eliminated rivals, orchestrating public executions of government officials he deemed disloyal. His brutal reign saw the use of chemical weapons against his own people, most notably in the 1988 Halabja massacre, where 5,000 Kurdish civilians were killed in a gas attack. His decision to invade Iran in 1980 led to a devastating 8-year war, costing over 1 million lives on both sides. In 1990, his invasion of Kuwait triggered the Gulf War, bringing international condemnation and military intervention. When faced with economic collapse from sanctions, he prioritized building lavish palaces while his people suffered. In 2003, after the US-led invasion, Saddam was captured hiding in a small subterranean hideout, his decades-long rule reduced to a desperate fugitive's final days. The fall of one tyrant was swift and humiliating, while another remained in power until his final breath, each leaving scars on their nations. Francisco Franco. Francisco Franco, Spain's dictator from 1939 to 1975, rose to prominence during the Spanish Civil War, where his nationalist forces defeated the Republican government in a brutal conflict that resulted in over 500,000 deaths. Once in power, Franco established a fascist, ultra-conservative regime, executing an estimated 200,000 political opponents, many of whom were buried in unmarked mass graves. While refusing to join Hitler in World War II, Franco sent the Blue Division, a unit of Spanish volunteers, to fight alongside the Nazis on the Eastern Front. One of the most shocking aspects of his regime was the kidnapping of thousands of children. Some estimates suggest up to 300,000 from families deemed politically unreliable, placing them with Francoist supporters to erase their leftist ties. Despite the repression, Franco managed to modernize Spain's economy in the 1960s, gaining support from the West during the Cold War due to his staunch anti-communist stance. When Franco died in 1975, the nation faced the challenge of dismantling a dictatorship. While Spain grappled with the legacy of its dictatorship, Chile faced its own dark chapter under the rule of Augusto Pinochet. Augusto Pinochet came to power in 1973 after leading a brutal coup. His dictatorship lasted 17 years. Under his rule, at least 3,095 people were executed or forcibly disappeared, while over 40,000 others were imprisoned and tortured by the DINA, his secret police. Despite his oppressive rule, Pinochet implemented radical free market economic policies. These policies led to rapid economic growth, but also widened the gap between the rich and poor. In 1998, while visiting London, he was arrested. However, citing poor health, he was allowed to return to Chile, where he faced multiple legal charges but never served a prison sentence. Pinochet died in 2006 at the age of 91, unrepentant and never convicted. Was he a protector of Chile or one of its greatest criminals? The debate continues. Muammar Gaddafi. For 42 years, from 1969 to 2011, he ruled Libya with an unpredictable mix of populism, repression, and self-indulgence. After seizing power in a bloodless coup against King Idris I at just 27 years old, he dismantled Libya's monarchy. Thousands of political opponents were imprisoned, tortured, or executed, with massacres like the 1996 Abu Salim prison massacre, where 1,200 prisoners were killed in a single day. Gaddafi funneled Libya's vast oil wealth into bizarre and grandiose projects, including his personal compound, Bab al-Azizia, which functioned as both a palace and a military fortress. By 2011, the Arab Spring ignited a nationwide uprising against his rule. As NATO-backed rebels closed in, Gaddafi fled his stronghold in Tripoli and was eventually captured in Sirte. His final moments were brutal, dragged from a drainpipe, beaten, and shot by the very people he once ruled. Did his downfall mark justice, or did it plunge Libya into further chaos? Nicolae Ceausescu. Nicolae Ceausescu, the dictator of Romania from 1965 to 1989, began his rule with promises of independence and prosperity, but ended it with bloodshed and famine. Obsessed with paying off the country's foreign debt, he imposed brutal austerity measures that left Romanians freezing in their homes and starving in the streets. Meanwhile, Ceausescu and his wife Elena lived in grotesque luxury, building the monstrous Palace of the Parliament, while children died of malnutrition in orphanages. His cult of personality reached absurd levels, with state media portraying him as a genius, a hero, and even a godlike figure. But in December 1989, the people had enough. As the revolution erupted, Ceausescu tried to flee but was captured, hastily tried, and executed by firing squad on Christmas Day. Did he ever realize, in those final moments, that his own people had come to see him as a monster? These dictators left a chilling mark on history, with their actions causing the deaths of millions and shaping nations through fear and oppression. What lessons can we learn from their rise and fall? Understanding history is the first step in ensuring that such dark times are never repeated. Write down your comments and impressions about this video. Don't forget to subscribe to be the first to learn more. Thank you for watching.